Hello, I'm Linda Elder. I'm the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I'm here with you today with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich. Hello, Gerald.
Hi, Linda. Good to be with you and to be talking about the elements of reasoning today, information. Yeah.
Yes, it's always a delight. The Foundation for Critical Thinking is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. And in this series, we are focused on the analysis of reasoning, going deeper. So if you are new to our work, you'll need to study some of the foundations first. And when you do, you'll be introduced to the elements of reasoning. Mm-hmm. And we are going deeper in the elements of reasoning in this series. And in this particular session, we're focusing on information. And so why don't we, Gerald, first just talk about the relationship between information and the other elements of reasoning. And would you like to just start there?
I was actually thinking, you said we were going to start with information related to standards. And
I did say that. I did, but
I was formulating what it is I was going to say, and then you asked me this different question. So,
well, I think since we're focusing on the elements of reasoning as a whole, as an introduction, we could just talk a little bit about information in relationship to the elements. So let me just do that, and then we'll come back to the elements and burrow a bit deeper. So the elements of reasoning, as you know, has 8 parts. Mm-hmm. Those of you who are viewing this, because you've been studying the work for some time. And information is one of the elements of reasoning. So very briefly, then, we could say that information is important in the following way in reasoning. Whenever we reason, we use information. We can't reason without information. And information is related to the other 7 elements. Mm-hmm. Reasoning. So we don't just have information in a vacuum. Information is related to our question at issue. Mm-hmm. And our purpose. Mm-hmm. And we make inferences based on the information, but we also are using assumptions in that process when we make inferences. Mm-hmm. And all of this is set within our point of view, within which we are often confined, even though we may think of ourselves as having all of this freedom of thought. We really are confined within narrow ways of looking at the world based on our history and where we are in history and what we've been taught to believe, and our gender and how we've been taught based on our gender, and so forth and so on. So we have a point of view within which we are locked. And this point of view is informed by our concepts. And all of these, of course, again, interrelate and lead to implications or consequences. So information is one of these elements of reasoning. Right. And so now we can move to intellectual standards, as we suggested earlier before the meeting, mm-hmm. and then we'll come back to the elements. So, Gerald, how do the standards help us with information?
Yeah. So let me say something about information. Information is neutral with respect to the standards. That is, as an element of reasoning, it's just information, whether it's accurate or inaccurate, whether it's important or unimportant. And exactly the same thing holds, as a matter of fact, for all of the elements. That is, the elements of reasoning, they're not the elements of good reasoning. They're the elements of any old reasoning. If you reason very badly, really badly, you still have a purpose. You're still addressing some question or problem. You're still making assumptions. You're still using information. All 8 of the elements of reasoning come in, even if your purpose is misguided, the question at issue is unclear, your assumptions are not accurate, your information is actually misinformation. So notice the standards come in the standards don't enter into the elements. And there are a couple of places, though, where the standards, in our ordinary parlance, the standards kind of work their way in that, and information is one of those. Another one, as an aside, is assumptions. So often when people think of assumptions, they think if there's something wrong with assumptions, and there isn't anything wrong with assumptions. There's something wrong with making inaccurate assumptions, but making accurate assumptions is fine. Making important assumptions is fine. Something similar is true with information. That is, people, when we talk about misinformation, we're hesitant to call it information. So it's just important to distinguish factual matters from whether something is true or false, accurate or inaccurate, important, unimportant. So if I say, just an obvious example, if I say Los Angeles is the capital of California, that's a piece of information. It's false information. It's inaccurate, right? But still, I would call it a piece of information. So one of the things about information, I mean, you talked about it in relation to the other elements, and let me say that for me, Linda, information is almost the least exciting of the 8 elements. I don't want to say it too strongly because I think they're going to be straightforward counterexamples to it. But I find that very few issues are ever settled by information. They're almost always settled by what you do with the information or the inferences you make. So a couple of pieces of information that I heard recently. One is that there are more Americans have been killed in the last 30 years, murdered in the last 30 years, than the number of Americans who died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, all combined. And that was in just 30 years. Now that's a piece of information, and it was startling to me. But notice, that doesn't tell me where to go with that information. It doesn't tell me how to address this problem or even how to understand it well. So I have another example, though, too. So here's one that's brought up by congressional leaders sometimes, and often by people in business. And it's that Amtrak, that's the rail service, and public rail service in the United States, has lost money every year of its existence. It's lost in some billions of dollars. And people often say, why would we as taxpayers support an institution that loses money every year? So it's information that it's lost money every year. I looked it up from Amtrak, and indeed it's true, so it's accurate. But what follows from that is not that we should not support an institution that doesn't make money. I mean, the business of government is to provide services. Very few of the services government provides make money. Do the police make money? Does Congress make money? The ones they levy this against is the post office and Amtrak, because they provide services. So notice, you make an inference to what we should do about it based on information. But information seems to me very seldom to settle an issue. So that's partly its relation to standards. One other standard I want to mention. By the standards of critical thinking, I'm meaning the ones we ordinarily list. Clear, accurate, relevant, precise, important or significant, deep, broad. And I just want to say important as one. That is, it's important always to have in mind the difference between significant information and information that's not important. And by important here, I mean important with respect to what you're trying to do, to achieving your purpose. And I say that partly because of my strong background in education, in that I think educators tend to emphasize information far more than they emphasize the other 7. Right? And so what we want to look for, or what we want to learn, or what we want to teach students to learn, is information that's important for achieving worthwhile purposes. That standard significance comes in very strongly. So it's a little bit about information and its relation to the standards.
Yes, well, of course, as we know, there are many angles from which we can approach these questions that we're asking. So let me follow up a bit, because there you talked a little bit about the relationship between information and the other elements,
Right.
and in terms of its importance. And then you talked about you introduced us to the relationship between information and the intellectual standards. So let me first focus on, well, either one. Let me focus on the intellectual standards a bit, because I think the others is a little more complicated. And it's interesting that you said that information was one of the least interesting ones of the elements, and I can see why you say that, because it's really how you're looking at the information that is often the problem. And yet, if we have confidence in reason, which is one of the intellectual virtues, if we learn what that means, which means follow the facts wherever they take you, whether you like it or not, whether you want to go there or not, just keep following at least what appear to be the facts. Sometimes you're off, but you've got to follow the truth. And that's going to come into play here as an important standard, wherever it leads you. Well, if you are trying to embody that, then by implication, you're embodying the tools of criticality. And one of those sets is this intellectual standards. And so if we truly are adhering to intellectual standards, and I'm going to go over them a bit again, if we're doing that, then we should be using information, we should be understanding all information in a reasonable way within context. So you mentioned some of the intellectual standards that we focus on. Let me just say, at one point we named these essential intellectual standards for all human thought, but there are other essential intellectual standards. And as a reminder, these come from hundreds extant in all ordinary languages. But this is a starting place. And when we take these seriously, then we begin to understand the role of intellectual standards, and we begin to see how other standards play a role. Okay, so just very briefly then, clarity. So let's relate that to information. We have to be clear about the information that we are gathering. And first of all, we don't, and this is very important, we don't think of information in any kind of vacuum. That's part of what you were saying as well. Information is always related to the question at issue. Why? Because the question determines the information that you have to gather and consider in good faith to answer that question. The question determines that, not the human being thinking. So the question guides the intellectual tasks required of us. And a primary intellectual task is to gather the relevant, significant information to answering that. Now, notice that it's sort of the way that I was described this, it sort of feels like just, follow the dotted line, just do this and then do that and everything will be fine. And you, that's what confidence in reason actually, I think, does mean. It doesn't mean that it's going to always be easy, but it means that that's the path. Okay, so we have to be, so we've got this information that we have to gather, so we need to be clear about what that is. We need to make sure that the information is accurate. In a way, this is it's like simple, like how could that be hard? Well, it's hard sometimes to figure out whether something is accurate, but it shouldn't be difficult to figure out whether you know whether it's accurate. You see what I mean? So you should be able to say, well, wait a minute, I don't know whether what you're saying is true. It may be true, but we're going to have to run this down. Now that part may take some time, but just figuring out whether this information is something that I should question is something that we should be able to learn to do. And again, it's not always easy if, for example, if people around you are manipulating you or lying to you and telling you, see, somebody that's very good at that may be giving you information that's inaccurate. So yeah, it's not always, I don't mean it to be that, I don't mean it to sound like it's that easy. I'm just saying that we are faced with some information. We say, is that accurate? So we can now, how do we check to see if it's accurate? There should be paths to those processes. And so we learn to follow that, those paths. And then precision. Sometimes we need a lot of detail in the information that we're gathering. Relevance, of course, the information has to be relevant to the question. So sometimes when people will give their reasoning and then they'll give information that's not relevant to it, then you have to say, wait a minute, how is that relevant to, right? So we have to make sure that the information is relevant. We have to make sure that it is deep where we have complexities. And here is one of the ways in which humans fail very frequently, because we're not learning how to reason through the complex problems that we face. And we're not learning to interconnect with one another well enough to answer these. So a critical thinker will say, what are the difficulties in the problem? And that relates, then that drives us to the information that we need to gather. And sometimes we need clusters of information. So now it gets to be more complicated. And then breadth. This means we need to consider more than one point of view. So often we are giving information that is relevant, accurate, precise, clear, deep, but only within one point of view. Only arguing for abortion or for whatever, whatever the case may be. You're arguing only for or against, for abortion, against abortion, whatever your argument is, you're only giving that side of the argument, which is typically done, let's say, in a traditional debate. You're only giving one side of the argument. You're giving that as well as you can, but you're not considering this other side, because your goal is not to consider the other side. Your goal is to defeat the other side.
Right.
So then that's antithetical to critical thinking. So there, obviously, we would need, if the question is broad, we would need information in all of the relevant viewpoints, all of the significant information within the relevant viewpoints to answer the question. Then we need to think logically about the information. And we need to see how it fits together. We need to be able to ask, how does information fit together though? How do we, let's say we want to actually sustain the Earth's resources, but how are we going? We've got this information. We've got this information about the oceans. We have this information about the air quality. We have this information about in every part of the Earth's surface, and it's like the life itself. So the question is, how do we fit these together? All of this information and this accurate information. How do we make it work together so that we actually sustain the Earth, not just you have the information over there and you're using it over here. So then significant, you already mentioned that, importance. So we have to make sure that we're looking at all the significant information, and we have to make sure that we're thinking fairly about the information, and we have to make sure that we have sufficient information to answer the question. So the reason why this feels, in a way, it sort of feels elementary is because if you just carry this around with you, and this page with these questions on it, and that focus on the intellectual standards, it's in multiple pages that we have. So we've got these questions and we've got these standards. So if we just follow this, then we would understand better how to use information. So that is something that is maybe the easiest way into information in terms of getting immediate power in the idea. So now let me pause.
Let me just address one thing that you said, and that is that information is, you began by saying information is always related to a question at issue and related to a purpose. And I'm going to say that's true when you're reasoning about something. If you're not reasoning about something, the information can just sit there.
Right. Yes. Yes.
My
True.
background in education, right? I mean, not the field of education, but in teaching, in that much teaching gives students information without any question at issue,
Right.
with just a question at issue that the teacher thinks of as important and the students don't care about much, maybe one way or the other. So it's when reasoning, when you're trying to figure something out, that's when the information fits together with all the other elements. Otherwise, it can just float off and be unimportant, just something you put down on an exam. Yeah. So
Well, and that there, yes, it like, so there's also this kind of information. Let's say, I don't know if this even counts as information, but maybe if you're just wandering in your mind from one thought to another, some of that will be information.
right.
Maybe you're falling asleep, or maybe you're taking a walk and you're just letting your mind flow, and this information comes up, and it's just there. Sometimes you grab hold of it and you do something with it, but
yeah.
Right. So we're thinking about information in relationship to reasoning when we're talking about critical reasoning, critical thinking. Right. So I was, yes, making that assumption. Yeah. Now, we can I think, go back, if we could, to the elements of reasoning again and talk a little bit about information in relationship with data, facts, evidence, observations, experiences, and reasons, which we also place in that element.
Right.
And I think one of the moves that we have to make that early on, which I think you've already made, but circling back to it, is the relationship between information and knowledge. And in other words, information, as you said, is neutral in and of itself. If I have information, it could be accurate, it could be inaccurate. It can be significant or can be trivial.
Right.
So I have this information, and a critical thinker understands that you need information that's accurate and relevant to the question at issue, right? If you're reasoning. And so that means that we have to be able to distinguish between information that is either just sitting there, as in inert information, or it is information that is, and maybe it's accurate, but we may be using information in our thinking that's inaccurate.
Right.
And this is where misinformation comes into play, because since people don't have these skills of criticality that we're talking about, they're using information in their thinking that's inaccurate. Right. And it's not based, therefore, in facts. So if we just take we're going to come back to inert information in a few minutes, but let's just take data. Let's take each one of these and just relate it to information. So information is neutral. You've got to apply intellectual standards to it to decide whether it's worthy of your consideration. Data is the same way. Data is like information. It's a certain type of information. Facts imply truth.
Right.
So, and then evidence
also. Right.
And this, I have to just say, this reminds me of Richard Paul's favorite definition of evidence. Evidence is something that makes something else evident.
That's very
and even though he's reusing the word, and that's not supposed to be allowed. So it's the fact that it is evident it means that it entails the intellectual standard of truthfulness.
Mhm.
or being factual.
Mhm.
And then observations are neutral.
Are neutral, right?
Experiences,
Goes,
that's a big one, right? Because we think of our experience, we don't think of our experiences as neutral. We think of our experiences as facts.
right.
These things happen to me.
Mhm.
And we don't realize that we have often twisted that
Right,
as experiences. And
right,
now they appear as facts.
right. Yeah, yeah. And also it's just kind of a standard thing that many people do, and that is to make generalizations based on their own experiences, right? And there's a way in which at heart, that's always a flaw. I mean, you can correct for the flaw in it by checking it out and testing other people's experiences and whether their experiences are the same, and paying very close attention to the nuances of how they interpret the experiences and so forth. But I think it's a very natural human thing to do, to base my view of the world on my own experiences. So I think it's a very natural human thing to do.
Mhm.
Leads us fundamentally astray a good deal of the time.
Yeah, that's why I think experiences are that category
Yeah.
is something that we need to take seriously
Yeah.
in our own minds, because we're using a lot of we're also, let's say, even if the information is accurate, I mean, I'm sorry, even if your memory is accurate of an experience,
Right.
it doesn't follow that you should be using that as information, right? In other words, you couldn't just close the door to that and say, I'm not going to be influenced by that. But it comes, you decide to use that as information. Now, obviously, sometimes it's relevant information and you want to use it as information. But sometimes you can close the door on those experiences.
I'm trying to think of an example of what you mean. Would this be one that maybe someone in my place of employment has mistreated me, and I'm trying to consider whether to stay at this place of employment, and I might just say, well, the fact that this person mistreated me, supposing it's factual, that's something I'm not going to pay attention to, because this is a bigger decision than that. Is that the kind of example you're thinking of?
Well, that could be an example, but it wasn't. I was thinking more of haunting memories.
Right. Yeah. I suspected that that's what you meant. I was staying away from it as an example, though. But yeah, you're right.
Now,
Yeah.
notice that analogy that I use, which I just thought of, haunting. It's haunting you, meaning you're trying to get away from it, but it keeps haunting. That's the way that we think about memories, but we don't really have to think about them that way. We can actually say, I'm not going to think about that anymore. That did happen to me in the past, but that's over. And that doesn't have power over me anymore. I mean, that's a basic critical thinking and psychological move, if we can make it.
Yeah.
So in other words, information, these experiences can be popping in ways that are not very useful and not very helpful.
Right. And let me go back to the one before, which is observation, because observation seems so much more straightforward, so much more in a way reliable than experiences. But one of the things about observation is that it's first of all, it's selective, right? What it is I observe in any situation is very, very highly selective. And the other one is that observation is also context dependent, meaning if I'm a high school kid and I'm looking through the microscope, what I see is a bunch of colors, whereas the instructor, the science person, might look through the microscope and what that person sees is a bunch of cells or the organelles inside. Right. So it depended on your observations are dependent on the context, in this case by your prior knowledge and integration of prior knowledge. So even observations are often not as straightforward as they seem.
Now, I'm glad that you went back to that, because I didn't mean to skip it and that I kind of did. And then, yeah, because observations are similar to experiences, because you are observing through your point of view and through your assumption base and through your concept maps. And therefore your observations can be poor. And you can observe. Let me just say this. I don't know if this is a good analogy, but imagine that you're a tennis player and you're observing very high, you're not that great, and you're observing not that good, you're new, you're an amateur, and you're observing very highly skilled players. And then you can say that really looks easy.
Right.
and then you also might, maybe you're even saying to yourself, yeah, I do that, I do that, I do that. And it's similar to being around a very highly skilled theoretician or thinker within a field. So why is it that some people would be observing, let us say, and this highly skilled thinker, and they don't even really know, can't even see the moves that this person's making, because they just they have no awareness. Now, I was doing a workshop recently with a set of teachers, and we've been studying critical thinking. And I asked them what they've been learning the first 2 weeks in this class. And one of the teachers, which I called on randomly, she wasn't raising her hand, so I was just inviting her to say what she had learned. And she very honestly said, to tell you the truth, I really don't understand anything that I'm reading.
Wow.
And that was helpful for me, because it reminded me of the complexities in critical thinking theory. So in other words, so she can observe me talking about critical thinking, and maybe in the moment it makes sense. But then when she goes back to her classroom, she says, I don't know how to do anything better now as a result of that. So you observe, your ability to observe is dependent upon your critical thinking abilities.
Right.
And your ability to understand your experiences in a reasonable way depends upon your critical thinking abilities. So that's the way in which they're similar.
Yeah, there's
parallel.
As you were speaking, another complexity of observation occurred to me, and it's that well, we've seen news footage recently, and I can say, well, I've observed the Russians shooting at Ukrainians. And that's an observation, and it's an accurate observation in its way. But really what I've observed is some Russians shooting at Ukrainians. There's a way in which I can just without thinking about it, generalize that observation to this group of people. So I see this individual or this group of individuals, and I observe them, but as I phrase it in my mind, I'm saying a term that applies to a great many other people aside from them, in addition to them. And that seems to me to be a very great built-in difficulty to observation, in that it depends on the categories we've got and that are active in our mind.
Yeah, so there is actually, you could see there is a lot to be explored in each of these categories. So we could go deeper in data. What does that even mean? Facts. What does that even mean? Evidence. Give examples of those. So each of these has a lot of depth. And then reasons.
Right.
Do you want to talk about?
I could say something about it. Originally, when Richard and I formed these into a circle, there were 9, and one of them was reasons, as you know, and I don't want to say this too strongly, but maybe we were both influenced by our philosophy backgrounds, where reasons is the primary thing that goes off. I mean, Harvey Siegel's definition of critical thinking, it just involves reasons, and I think it's probably Richard, but maybe both of us played a role in this. We decided to take reasons out as one of the prime categories, not so much because it belongs in information, but because it moves around in various of the other elements. My reason for doing X, Y, and Z might be an assumption I make. My reason for it might be an implication that it has. If I do this, bad things will happen, therefore I'm not going to do this. So the implication is actually a reason for not doing it. So, and information is also a reason, but it's a more flexible, in much the way, it just occurs to me now, in much the way when we do the standards, reasonable is not one of the standards we list, though in your book, you talk about reasonable as a standard a great deal. But the reason we don't list it, maybe multiple reasons. One of the reasons we don't list it is that reasonable fits all the other standards, right? Is it reasonable with respect to depth? Is it reasonable with respect to precision? Is it reasonable with respect to accuracy? So reasonable I don't want to be committed to what it is I just said. I saw you looking up, like wondering if that's true.
No, there are so many angles. Go ahead. No, keep going.
Yes. Back to reasons. There seems to me nothing wrong with including reasons as information, because information often serves as our reason for doing something, our reasons for an inference we're making, or conclusion we're drawing. But in actual English usage, reasons can be many of the things. Can even be a purpose, right?
Right, and actually, the way that you can prove this is by saying, if I ask you, Gerald, if I say, Gerald, what was your reason for doing this? You might tell me your purpose.
Right.
You might tell me your question at issue. You might tell me information. You might tell me any of the elements of reasoning.
Right. Right.
So reasons permeates, it's sort of a nuisance in a way, because it's got to be in there, as you say, because that's the way, I mean, philosophers sort of want that and need that. But it's important to understand that if you understand if people can understand what I just said, that if I say, what is your reason? You're not necessarily going to give me information in response. You may give me an assumption. You may give me any of the other elements.
Right. I don't know that you could do it with question and issue, but the other, because it's a question. So what? Well,
I don't know. I thought about that before I said that, because if I say, what was your reason? And you say, well, because I was trying to figure out how to get the car started. Okay. So that's a problem. That's an issue.
Right. But when you say it that way, I don't want to harp on something this specific, but when you say it that way, you're actually embedding the question inside a statement. If you're asking, then I could say, because I was asking the question, how do I get the car to start? Right.
That still could count as a reason.
Right. But I don't think you could say, what's your reason for doing that? And I say, how can I get the car to start? That if I just say the question at issue, it just doesn't quite work out.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, it's true that we could make any number of moves. Right. And so, but we have reasons there, because often when we give our reasons, we are giving the information. Right. And so it made most sense to place it there.
Indeed. Yeah.
Right. So, and it's very important. What this also reveals is it's very important for people to understand the spirit of the elements of reasoning.
Indeed. Yeah.
Not the law of the elements of reasoning. So right. When we look at any of the elements, we could add other terms that we just couldn't fit into this small circle. Eventually, you can get going with synonyms, and so then you have a long list of big network. But we should be able to do this in our minds. We should see that this is not just 8 elements, but it has a lot of complexities. There are a lot of complexities within each one, and some messiness as well, to some overlap in certain cases.
Right. So let me just not comment on that, but add something to that. And that is that Richard would often say, and I would often say, I'll just speak for myself then. These are the 8 elements, meaning there aren't any others. Within each category, within each wedge of the circle, there's a lot of flexibility and terms can move around, but these are the 8. So I've never heard anyone give me an element of reasoning that's not included on the list, at least implicitly. So I often say hypothesis is an element of reasoning, but hypothesis is really either an assumption or a conclusion held tentatively, right?
Yes,
So it's
yes.
implicit on the list, but I have not heard anyone offer me an element that is not on the list. And if someone did, of course, it means we'd have to expand the list of elements. I mean, it's not saying this is set in stone. It's to say this is, as far as I can tell, completely. This one is complete. Very unlike the standards, because there's no complete list of standards at all.
Yes, I think that, and that's because of the research that went into the development of these elements.
Right.
Beginning with Richard's dissertation and moving into the era in which you were working with him and it comes together in a circle. That's 20 years or more. I probably have that wrong, but it's a lot of years of study.
Right.
And looking to make sure that nothing was missing. And
yeah. And I let me make this comment. It's not directly about information though, but it's about the elements. When I consider Richard's insight in coming up with the elements as just as brilliant, in that before Richard did this, and even after, but before Richard did this, people always thought of elements, of what we're calling the elements, as not as concepts, which are flexible in and of themselves, but as part of a sentence, like identify your assumptions. So an important thing to do is to identify your assumptions. Another one is to state your purpose, or bring in standards as well. Be very clear about your reasons. Make sure your reasons are accurate. Those are the kinds of things that permeate other approaches to critical thinking, right? They're embedded so that you get an action word like evaluate or assess your reasons accurately, right? So it's got an action, an element, and a standard all together. And what that does is it limits what you do, because you don't want to just evaluate your reasons. You also want to evaluate your purposes. You want to evaluate your point of view. You want to evaluate the question at issue. So what Richard did is extract from these sentences individual elements, which are concepts. And the nature of concepts is that they're very flexible. They apply everywhere. So as he often emphasized, that you don't just identify the information you need, you evaluate the information you need, you compare my information with your information, we synthesize this information with that information. So I can do a huge number of things using the concept of information. And I can do far more than I could ever enumerate in a list of what you do with information. So I always thought
that's a very powerful understanding. And thank you for sharing that. And so one of the things that Richard Paul was master at was looking at a lot of data, and from this pulling out the key concepts and going down to the foundational ideas. So our work is fundamentally conceptual, which is one of the reasons why it doesn't fit very well in human societies, because it's not scientific. See, it's like, what is this? What are these concepts these people are using over here? It's that's the way that I think our work is sometimes, if not often, viewed. So this, and you're right. So, but going back to this, the elements of reasoning in the wheel, this is, as you say, this was brilliant because what Richard basically did is took these lists of, we could call them micro skills and macro skills, because some of them are more complex, but this list of abilities, skills and abilities. So we take this and we say, but we can't work within a list as thinkers. That's not reasonable. We need foundational concepts that are easier than that.
Right.
And so we've got the elements of reasoning, and that's just so much easier then we have to now apply the standards to the elements. So in a way, it seems harder, because then you have to figure out the list, right? You have to figure these skills out, but you do it in a dynamic process. That's how it works. That's why it works.
Right. And I'm thinking you know this, but when I first began working with Richard, the emphasis he put was on what he called micro skills, which were not the elements, but the elements were a part, as they are in all approaches to critical thinking. But then the move that I later realized was just unique and extremely powerful, was to step away from the micro skills and identify the elements as part of those micro skills. The micro skills were things like identify your purpose or identify your assumptions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, that's how you and he were teaching it whenever I came to the first workshop in 1992. I mean, the circle was there, but you were still focusing also on the abilities in a kind of list format to show, I think, the relationship between this new way of thinking about it and the way we traditionally did, I guess, at that point, which was in the list format. Okay, so let's move on then back to information.
Okay.
So we could burrow in further, obviously, into any of these other terms within information, but the most important, or a most important point, is for us to understand that, like all of the elements of reasoning, information in itself is not necessarily adhering to any intellectual standards. And therefore, we can't count on information. You see something on the internet.
Right.
So a bunch of people said it was true on Facebook. That's information.
Right.
And that does not mean that there's truth in it.
Right.
And people think that if a lot of people, I often hear people say, well, a lot of people were watching that. So a lot of people are watching it does not mean it's true.
No.
And so then you can see how misinformation can easily be spread among people who do not have this ability or these abilities to distinguish good information from, as it were, bad information in context.
Yeah. And let me just say something about that. And it's that I would say exactly the same sentence you just said, that people often don't have the abilities or the skills. And that's true, but it can make it sound like what you said about watching the great tennis player make a move and thinking, oh, I can do that. That is, it's not evaluating information or assessing how accurate it is. It's not like that's an all or nothing kind of ability, or that you can just decide to do that. It takes lots of practice over and over again, and it takes making mistakes a lot of time, getting things wrong, and then realizing it, owning up to getting it wrong, and actively looking for corroboration, say, or evidence, to use the other word. And I think that takes time. It takes time just the way playing tennis takes time. Not just hitting the ball over the net, but playing tennis. I don't mean like a star, but just playing tennis well. And I think that's true of very much of critical thinking. It's got to be practiced over and over again. And it's particularly true with information, where there's this great glut of information, accurate as well as inaccurate, all over the place. It's very hard often to tell what's accurate and inaccurate.
Well, I think the way that I think of that is that if we were teaching these foundations
Mhm.
in schools, colleges, and universities, then students would begin to get some sense of intellectual standards and how they play a role in
Indeed. Yeah.
thinking. You see, they would have these tools. Right now, what I'm saying is if we develop the tools, they provide the avenues for our reasoning.
Right.
And it's not as if you have to be, you know, it's accessible to everyone. That's what I'm trying to say, that all of us can have access to this, but we have to learn these tools, and we need to, as you say, practice using them. And then we have to have confidence in them and not be persuaded by other views. So in other words, we're not thinking of the information objectively. Instead, we're thinking of it in terms of the way that other people are viewing it. So if they believe it, then we believe it.
Right.
That's the what we want to avoid.
The skills that would have to be taught would be how to evaluate information. So you would have students evaluating information, assessing it for accuracy, say, over and over again as they progress through school. Instead, what teachers tend to do is give them information, which is presumed accurate, but it doesn't help develop the skills of how do you tell that something is accurate. So you got to focus on that, on the how do you tell? Because once you're outside of school, you just get all this information, and it's not mediated by this teacher who we hope has your best interests at heart. So you get no skills of assessing the accuracy of information.
Now, before we leave the concepts that you brought up, I want to circle back on the concept of reasonable as an intellectual standard, because you were referring to my views on that. So I want to say what my views are.
Okay.
Because the way that I think of the concept or the standard of reasonable is that it's a macro, what I would call macro intellectual standard.
Right.
And that means it's multi-logical and it entails other standards. So, and it is contextual as well. It has to be used in a contextual way. I mean, in terms of the context. So for example, if I say, you're really not being reasonable right now, I might mean you're not being logical. You're not just looking at the facts and following where the facts are leading you. I might be saying you are not being polite to me.
Right.
So it's stretched a bit. And but it's and you might say you're requesting, if you're not being reasonable, you're requiring too much of me.
Right.
So if you're reasonable, then I guess again it depends on it. Again, you'd have to say, well, what is the context?
Yeah.
Is it reasonable for me to have the lifestyle that I have? Let's say that's the question. Well, what is your lifestyle? What are the variables in your life? What is your situation? How many people are you taking care of? How many kids do you have? How many, you see all these things. What are your responsibilities? You've got it. Then I'd have to say, well, are you able to maintain all of this? Is that a reasonable schedule? You see, can you pull it off? So reasonable might mean logical. It might be sort of an easy connection. You might find an easy connection to intellectual standards, or you might be using it in a different, broader way. And Gerald, I want to say, this is for anyone listening. I remember a time when I first started learning critical thinking, when I couldn't really, I don't think I could define anything. Like if somebody told me to give it a definition of something, I would have had a very difficult time, and still I will struggle unless I've really been over the territory
Mhm.
a lot, right? So to be able to make the moves that I just made about the concept of reasonable, as I was thinking of that, that is all coming from my critical thinking
Right,
practice.
right. Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, I cannot articulate a definition. And I felt the weight of my ignorance.
Uh-huh.
And so if anyone is feeling that, then that's where you are in the beginning of when you first begin conceptual work, because if you were before you've had any practice, well, how would you just automatically be able to define lots of things? No, you have to practice that.
That's right. Yeah. 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 It requires practice, and it leads to clarity and precision in your thinking. I mean, you can get along in the world even if you're unable to define many of your concepts, but my judgment is you get along better if you have that ability to be clear and precise about your how you define important words in your life, how you define what's a friend, how you define what's a loving relationship, or any number of important concepts, right?
Now, one of the things we haven't really tapped into too much is how people frequently, and by this I mean all of us, distort information or leave out relevant information that doesn't serve our selfish interest.
Indeed, yeah.
Or our group's selfish interest.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some sort of easy targets here. So take companies that hide information, that if this information were to get out into the public, would show that they are causing harm to the public. So therefore, but they may be pushing forward the information that they are using that is relevant, so that it looks like they're being reasonable. So but they're hiding this from us. Another example that's easy would be a prosecutor who hides exculpatory evidence.
Yeah, right.
And this is routinely done. So you're hiding information that's relevant to whether this person is guilty.
Right.
And you have an obligation legally to give that information to the other side. So these are a couple of examples. So, but all of us do this. So we'd have to ask ourselves, any one of us, well, how do I distort information to fit my viewpoint, let's just say? So what do I ignore that I don't want to see? Sorry, go ahead.
No. You said hide information. You said there are easy cases, straightforward cases, and those, what makes them easy, I'm thinking, or one factor that makes them easy is that it was an explicit decision by companies to hide this information, and it's an explicit decision by a prosecutor to hide the information, the exculpatory information. More insidious in a way was the way we hide things without realizing it. Is we just don't. We just neglect, it might be the word, neglect to notice or to think about the information that harms the case that we're making. I just remember an old time movie in which the guy, he's in love with this woman, and they meet her father, who's a strict, upright old gentleman, and the young man says, "I'm in public relations," and the father says, "And what do you do?" He says, "Well, then I tell people about the company I work for and all the good they're doing." And the father says, "And do you also tell the customers about the bad they're doing?" And the guy says, he's just kind of confused by the question. So it's not as if he suppressed saying the bad. It's just his job is to say the good. And so those are the things he says, and those are the things he notices. And it's kind of under the surface. And we do that. I mean, that's a fairly explicit case, but we do that in our personal relationships all over the place. And
Mhm.
hard to think of people getting a divorce without doing that, where they're very selective in the information they're paying attention to about what the other person did.
Mhm.
Mhm,
Right. So this is it permeates, this problem permeates our
mhm,
lives, but we can see it in other people and we can see it in paradigm cases. And in business, I mean, part of the concept, the very concept of business is about, well, just making money.
mhm,
And whatever that takes,
mhm,
then we're sorry if we sort of ran over a bunch of people and killed them. You know,
mhm.
it's a dog eat dog world, and
Right,
we've got to make as much money as we can. So obviously we've got to hide things. Of course we've got to hide things.
right,
It's understood that you would have to do that
right,
in the way that it's at the unconscious level too. It's not stated.
right, right,
I mean, sometimes I assume that it is stated where people are in a room saying, we don't want this data to get out. That also, of course, happens.
right. And as I know, I mean, the one about companies is even has a legal substance to it, in that the Supreme Court has ruled that companies can't engage in benevolent works if it detracts from the amount of money they pay to shareholders, because those shareholders own the company. They're entitled to all the profit they can get. That's kind of the legal requirement. And so companies can, I don't want to say quite hide behind it, but can invoke that law, that legal status to justify, or seem
Mhm.
to try to justify the practices they engage in. It doesn't allow them to engage in illegal. The law doesn't allow them to engage in illegal practices, but it makes the tension between what's legal and illegal, and what you hide and what you don't hide.
Well, and it's also what's implicit, right? What we don't state
Mm-hmm.
that is there, that's sort of understood.
Indeed, yeah.
And often there are also, like, ethical standards that we say we're adhering to at the same time
Mm-hmm.
in these companies. So there are so many ways to think about how we distort information or we ignore relevant information. So take a person who's living with someone who's highly abusive
Mm-hmm.
to that person.
Mm-hmm.
And the person who's being abused is giving all kinds of excuses for the other person.
Yeah.
As an example.
Right. Right.
Yes, but actually,
Yeah.
she's really a beautiful person. She doesn't mean to be saying these things to me,
Mm-hmm.
but he's good in the following ways,
Mm-hmm.
So the moves that they make to avoid seeing the
Mm-hmm.
abuse.
Mm-hmm.
This is the distortion of the information example. It's an
Yeah.
example that we're talking about.
Right.
So to bring it a little closer to home.
Mm-hmm.
But you could say, well, how am I distorting, for example, the views of my spouse or my companion or my friends or whatever the case may be? Am I seeing their views the way that they are,
Mm-hmm.
or am I not seeing that?
Mm-hmm.
So information becomes more complex the more we burrow into this.
Mm-hmm.
So to put a cap on that, to the degree that your ego is involved or your egocentricity is involved, then you're going to be distorting the information.
Yeah. 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 And I don't know if it's deeper, but it's different sociocentricity piece comes in. If I think of the kind of self-serving things people say and believe in relation to their own country, say. I know there were innumerable movies in which people, rogue terrorists in another country, like I remember one about Libya, and they had access to a nuclear weapon or something like that, and we sent in the small band of elite troops who went in and rescued released the nuclear weapon and saved the world. And I'm thinking, what would you think if a band of Libyans came into the United States to rescue, to liberate a small cell of people who had a nuclear weapon? Would you say, oh, thank you, Libya, for doing that? So the fact that we're going in, I'm not saying that it was wrong to do it. It might be a greater good, but it's just taken for granted that going into this other country for a good purpose allows you to invade this other country. It's very, very strange. You wouldn't countenance it if it were in the other direction.
Right, exactly. So that shows a lack of intellectual integrity, or in other words, hypocrisy, to applying different standards to others than you do to yourself. Yes. So there are so many examples here that we can think of. And by the way, so I was capping that and you added sociocentrism. So I didn't sort of finish, so thank you for helping me with that. So the idea was this. So whenever our egocentricity or our sociocentricity are involved, group think. So our group is the best. You brought the example of nationalism, which is a very significant problem internationally. So and that's just one of many examples. So where we have this, we're going to have, so whenever we have either of these operating within us, group think or thinking within just my own point of view, then there's going to be some distortion of information.
Yeah. Right.
And therefore, we can always say, if my ego starts to get involved, I can say, okay, well, how am I missing the information? And by the way, egocentricity also includes, for example, not valuing your own abilities. So if you're not able to accurately see the information about yourself that is positive, and this is going to have serious implications, for example, your mental well-being.
Right.
And that's your egocentricity saying you're too dumb, you're too stupid, you can't do that. So whenever that's involved, you're going to be distorting information. Yeah.
That's a particularly nice move because it takes away some of the negativity, a certain kind of the negativity from egocentricity, as if you're just being selfish and you're doing things that are going to make you money or give you power. Well, you could also, for egocentric reasons, do things that will result in you getting less money and less power and doing less of the things that are worthwhile for you to do. And that's a nice broadening of the concept of people's usual concept of egocentrism.
Right. And you can also, for example, give too much of yourself away. This also has implications for mental well-being. So let's just take a mother who has a number of children and works and has a husband who's not very helpful. We see there's going to be, that's going to be too much for that person to manage. And to think that you can manage that and still keep your sanity, then my question will be, well, how are you going to manage that? Do you have downtime for yourself? Do you require 2 hours a day alone in your room reading with no one entering, for example, or doing your gymnastics or whatever you want to do? Do you see, how are you taking care of yourself? So you might say, well, he needs that and she needs that and he needs this and they do this and I've got to do this and I've got to do this for them. That's all information, but there's also information about yourself that you're ignoring.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Gerald, I think we should bring this to a close. And in the next session, focus on entered information, activated knowledge, and activated ignorance, and get into the relationship between knowledge and information.
Okay, good.
And we'll close for today.
Okay.
It's been enlightening.
It's been really vital and interesting. And it's really nice to talk with you. Every session we have on this, even though we worked on these elements over and over and over again, it's still really deep and enlightening to talk about.
It is. And thank you for those that are joining us. Hopefully this was helpful for you to go a little deeper and to see us working through some of these deeper concepts. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us.
Good night.